I'm not suggesting that I have every answer.
Yeah, by the way.
I'm not doing that.
First race for you.
We're not like, it's not like a challenge. See if you can stump them. But because that can happen. Yeah.
All right, we're gonna start over here. You guys, back left. Oh, we're going.
Oh, okay. All right.
My back left. Your back right. Sorry.
The two we came to were.
We'll just one at a time.
One at a time.
Do one on each table, and then if we get to the second, we'll go.
A lot of people have a hard time with the lack of quote unquote proof that God exists. So why doesn't God provide more of a pathway that is provable instead of keeping it abstract and mysterious?
Yeah. So proof that God exists that they find that say maybe unconvincing is kind of what you're.
Yeah. Like
Why doesn't he make it more obvious?
Okay.
Like, there's so many people.
Right. So it's you said abstract. So it's kind of you get abstract ideas. You get philosophical reasoning where it's okay. There's things about a beginning, the necessity of a first cause. These are philosophical arguments. The need for a cause for like morality that we were just talking about. Okay, but these are philosophical. These are involve philosophical reasoning based on sometimes abstract things. And we'd say, okay, well, there's something there, but then the question, well, why not be more obvious? And it's a fair question that people struggle with. In my dealing with it, and others have gone into this a lot more than I have, but it seems that there's a significance to us wanting to seek it out and not just have it be shown to us. And that God wants us to actually want to know the answers and to actually seek for truth, to ask questions, to actually be getting into conversation with each other, with others, talking about it and seeking out the answer to our questions. If it's, well, God just makes it obvious, well, then let's say it was wildly obvious. Then you'd say, well, how does someone even reject? You're like, it's just right there. So it's stupid not to just accept that. Well, now the issue of where's your heart, and then what do you even want there to be a creator that you would submit to, and dealing with those questions, like that doesn't even come up. It's not about your heart. It's just well, that's just a matter of fact, obvious. Like who am I to? I can't say anything against that. If it's so, then you get to like what degree of obvious, right? I don't know how I don't personally know how you'd find this. Here's the perfect degree. This is the exact, like on some scale of 1 to 1,000,000, and it's like we find the point at which this is the perfect balance of God being obvious. I think maybe God did find that, but I don't know how we would know what it is. So it's, but the issue is I think God wants us to know where we're at over the course of our life, we come to an end. He wants us to know when we die that I want nothing to do with this God. I don't want to know, I reject it, to know that we reject it. Or to know that, hey, I want to be with my Creator. I submit to my Creator, know where I'm at. And you get this idea within the be hot or cold. And that God hates lukewarm, wants to spit it out of his mouth. Where you just can't, you're trying to do both sides of the fence thing. It's like, be hot or cold. But he wants us to come to a point where we know, and when we come before God, we know exactly what our decision was. And so I have found that appealing. And I think that's got a lot of merit to it, that's what God wants. But what does that involve? To get to that point, well, not just making it obvious to you, is you have to want to know and care about the important questions, the things that matter about life. And not just your convenience, not just what you want. You have to care about things that matter. and say, well, okay, but yeah, I like this, but this is just likes. Here's the stuff that matters, and I got to figure that out. And do I care about truth? And is that something that's significant to me? And am I willing to actually submit myself to truth? Or I want to be God, and I want to create it my way? Well, that's a big question. Well, if God just makes it extremely obvious, it's like, well, we're not even in that position. It's like, well, this is just plain. You can ignore it and not care, I guess. But I think there's something about our hearts to search and to be like, hey, we need to seek this out. And I think every one of us has encountered somebody that they're really, gosh, I'm really struggling with this and I want to know. And it's an important question to ask people, like, if it was true, would you believe it? If you determine that. But it's amazing how some people are like, no. If I determined it was true, I wouldn't follow. Like, what the heck? But but that question, would you? And I think that matters to God on the heart level. And so it's because of the heart level would be the main thing I'd get on that. But he wants us to seek and want to know, not just, here, it's in your face. If what I'm saying works, he's got to ingrain some things in us, in our nature. Like this, there's this curiosity and the reasoning and caring about reasoning and thinking and that we ponder things and that we like want to know answers to things. Like that's part of our nature. So that it actually goes against our nature when we're like, I don't care. And I don't want to know the truth. That doesn't matter to me. That's just inconvenient. You're actually going against your nature. And so I think that would be the other side of that needs to come together with him not being so obvious. He needs to create us in that way that we want to know things. And then it's curious when people don't want to know certain things, but they want to know lots of other stuff. But why don't you want to know this one? Yeah. So.
Stable.
So our question sort of maybe dovetails on that a little bit, on sort of this problem of divine hiddenness that's modern atheists been like espoused in it. I guess he's more focused on this question of God's justice as it relates to different people's barrier to belief.
Mm-hmm.
So in like Luke 16, when Jesus tells this parable of Lazarus and the rich man, Abraham concludes like, no, I'm not going to grant you the ability to have your brothers see the risen Lazarus because they have the text,
Mm-hmm.
and even if they saw him, they wouldn't believe. But then in John 20, Jesus appears to Thomas, right? He goes, oh, you've seen me, now you believe. And then sure blesses other people who just believe but don't see. But it seems like if you were to chart Thomas, the ease at which Thomas could believe, like his barrier to entry into belief is a lot lower than, someone who doesn't get to see. And I suppose you see this problem across time and geography. There are different barriers to entry to belief. And if God were just, why wouldn't everyone's barrier be equal?
That's fascinating. Just how you put that. Why wouldn't the barrier be equal? Okay, so.
If I can extrapolate that a bit, it's almost like the question, maybe I'm missing here, but why is it fair that not everyone gets to hear about Jesus and come to a saving faith, or have the opportunity to come to a saving faith, right? In that
Sort of.
Different thresholds of salvation, and one of those thresholds is not hearing at all, and therefore. Right.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are like apologists today that have sort of concluded with like, the tribe in Africa or in New Guinea that has never had outside human contact, well, they'll be judged differently, right, because they haven't had the opportunity. But like in a more modern sense, right, like someone who grew up, on the outskirts of town versus someone who grew up in a church versus Thomas versus, right, like all have some ability, but it's clearly not equal, right, versus absolutely none. where you could respond, oh, they're just going straight to heaven, or they'll be judged, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
by some other standard.
Okay, so I think there's two levels of this. The second level is what
Good,
Jason's bringing up. On the first level, with it's coming down to just with God and the Creator, because then you get to the second level of okay, then a specific religion, and here's a religious claim about a person. So when we get into a concept in theology called general revelation, is that familiar? This comes from Romans 1. And in Romans 1, it talks about how what could be known about God is plainly seen, being understood through what has been made. And that's what has given rise to this theological idea of general revelation, in that God has revealed what the extent of what we need in nature. And we get what's called a natural theology that will come out of this, where we say, okay, so God's revealed that in nature, and the questions that arise about how is it that we can survive and that we can exist and all these things. And then we start looking at the world that we're in. And so in light of that, it says what can be understood through what has been made. It's plainly seen. And in the general revelation theory, you get multiple ideas. So there's design ideas come in with design of the world and its ability to sustain life. You get the idea of purpose and the questions about purpose, and then you get the questions about morality. And that we can't escape the fact that we're like, that's evil, that's good, there's this good and evil distinction. Why? I totally recognize it, but why is that the case? And who determined that? Clearly I didn't, right? And so you're grappling with these questions. And why are things evil? Why are things good? What makes it that way? How is it that everything is such that it allows us to survive, and so many of us to survive? And then you start looking at the examination of our own bodies and how things function, and you get into just things like the mystery of sight, which is just amazing on the scientific level. And you dive into some of these things, and you say, okay, well, this is what we're talking about in Romans 1 with this general revelation. That is, he's given us things that I don't need any scripture to comprehend those things. And all he's doing in Romans is pointing out that this is the nature of the world for us, and that this natural theology, that's what we all experience in the same way. And those questions we all have, all of that leading to, could there be a creator? Did someone make it this way, right? It just naturally leads to that. And he's saying those things, he says you're without excuse, because those things naturally lead to that conclusion. So the whole process and what you see and the questions that follow from that. So on the general revelation level, the idea would be we all have the same revelation, that God has revealed that to us. Now God knows how we handle it and what we do with that. And he knows every one of our hearts. And what's interesting to add here is, okay, so we have a responsibility to care and want to know things, because he made us in that way to care about things and to have this curiosity and propensity to question. Well, we have a responsibility then to follow up on that and actually carry it out and try to sort through things and ask the questions and talk about it and want to know more. So God knows if we're being responsible and that we are actually, say, taking in and assessing the things in the general revelation and how he's revealed himself. As we do that, or don't do that, then you get into the other side of general revelation called special revelation. And it's the idea that as we've done that, now God, based on seeing our heart and our responsibility in response to that, now will reveal himself more directly. And that's through things like the gospel. If you were meeting Jesus, if you were alive at the time, that would obviously be a special revelation. If you were healed, something like that. If you're at the Sermon on the Mount, that's a special revelation. Getting the Word of God is a special revelation. But there's things that nowadays are a special revelation on that level, and it would be, in general, it's in response to our our response to this general revelation. And now God is following up on that. Now, other things, of course, that people just get in special revelation because they happen to live in a certain country, and it's like, well, there's a Bible right there, and this Christian person I know is talking to me about it. Yeah, that's part of their responsibility. They're supposed to do that, right? They've been called to do that. That's why people care about getting the scripture into whatever languages that don't have it, right? And say, okay, we need to get this, put effort into getting that spread out. But those deeper questions on the special revelation then bring us to these questions of where Jason took us is, okay, well, some people are hearing, some are not. Well, we could say that's not fair with somebody didn't hear it. And I don't know, this isn't exactly where your question was, but kind of that going farther. If these people didn't hear, well, that's not fair. Well, if God knows their heart and knows people aren't interested and they don't care because they don't even care about general revelation, he's not like, well, I wonder what would have happened if they would have heard about Jesus or would have heard the gospel. He knows there's nothing would have happened. They aren't interested. They find it inconvenient, the whole thing. So in that, knowing that, it's not like God has some obligation, like I gotta make sure he already knows the answer. So that starts to narrow that down. And then it's not just what if somebody didn't hear it? Then it starts to become, what about if someone who is interested and who is seeking, and then because of tragic circumstances, they don't get it, they don't ever have the chance. Then now you got a real question we're at the heart of it. Because God may know totally well about somebody that, well, they lived their whole life. Yeah, they never heard. They had no interest at all. They didn't even entertain questions about this that was inconvenient to them. They don't want to talk about it. God already knows that. So there's not a mystery there. So I'd say it that way that narrows down. It's not as broad as we might think. Well, what if somebody just didn't hear? Well, God knows a lot about them. That they rejected their creator. You rejected their creator. I mean, he says, if you reject the Father, reject me. That's coming from Jesus. So so you kind of can back that up and say, okay, so if we push that aside now, where is the heart of the question on that level? And it's these people that they didn't get it. They would want to know. They are interested. They do wonder about these things. They do ask questions. And they're in a situation where they could never get the right answer, right? Even though they're seeking. And then that's what the heart of that one is. Hopefully my distinctions made sense on that.
One thing there, I think also there's the question of, you said, is that fair or just, right? And then the question is salvation an act of obligation or an act of grace, right? And so if God was fair and was being just without Jesus coming into the picture, none of us are saved because of the penalty of sin and our rejection of our creator, right? And so to say that one person being saved one way or having a different barrier to entry is not fair, well, then it calls into question what is grace, because grace means God doesn't have to do it, right? He's totally just in not saving people, which is hard to hear, right? But that is like, anyway.
I will say on the Thomas part of that, so based on how Thomas has responded all previously to the general revelation, in that circumstance, based on his question and knowing his heart and that he does care about this and he happens to be there, he gives him that special revelation. He gave it to all, but he didn't just give it to him. I mean, he gave it to all the people. He only gave it to everybody at the time. He just did it a little more intentionally with Thomas, but I think you have to take into account there's a relationship that they have, and there's a purpose that Jesus has for Thomas. And so what I love about the Thomas story is you don't see any ridicule. He's not like, why are you asking that? Why aren't you so sure? Why are you doubting? Right? And then we put this name on him, doubting Thomas. Jesus didn't raise that, right? Jesus wasn't like, what's wrong with you? he's like, okay, let's talk. All right. So, yeah.
And before we move on to the next question, we're gonna extend this, so we typically end at 9. If anyone needs to leave at 9, feel free to sneak out. We're gonna go for another 15 minutes to make sure we can get some more questions in, so just, heads up. Yeah, feel free to leave around 9 if you have to.
Are we here?
And how cool too that the guy said, I will never believe unless I put my hand in his side and his feet and his hands. Went the furthest, he went to India to go declare, he was so on fire for Jesus, he just couldn't stop it, right?
Yeah.
So like, sometimes those people who seem so far away, like,
Well, like Paul,
right, absolutely. God can transform.
he's killing people. Then he's like, whoops. Yeah.
All right. Question from you guys.
Yeah, so I guess just, we raised a bunch of objections, people throw out there. Should I go through that list, or should I go the one?
We'll get to
choose
choose
one?
one.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I had one question too around, just, you gave a great defense, by the way, thank you so much for being here, and it's great stuff. What if the disciples were all crazy or high? What do you say about that? There's mass cults, mass delusions all the
Yeah.
time, like, how would you do this?
Now you said it a certain way, is you said if they were all crazy or high, and high, both.
Either or.
So the idea of all of them would be something that we've never seen in any other context. What you have with cults is you have one, maybe two fanatics who then others have kind of latched onto, but you could identify, here's the person that's driving it, or the two people that are driving it. So I'll address it in that context more so than they're all at the same level. And my assessment of that is, none of those people are in it to die. So they'd be like, we're excited about this, and but the reason we're excited about it is probably something to do with our own benefit. So we're gonna get rich, because who's rich in our society? Religious leaders. So here's how you get this would be great. Or we want to be in power, and who's in power? Religious leaders. So we're creating our own faction that we can be in that kind of a status. As soon as someone starts dying, so let's say the fanatic dies, all the others say, I guess that didn't work out very well, and I'm kind of done with it. And what you see with cults is the leader dies and that comes to an end, or you see a mass where they all die. And there's just some big mass suicide or whatever with the common people or something, whatever it is. And you're like, okay, and then it comes to an end. It's very distinct what you see with the disciples, or the apostles in this case. They're not together dying. And when one dies, it doesn't affect the others at all. I mean, as far as what their purpose is.
Just grows it.
It grows it, yeah. But what you see is one dies, and when they die, they're on their own in a situation where, in fact, no one would have known if they didn't. If they just capitulated and said, never mind. And they could have just gave up and disappeared, and people would have thought they were dead. Thomas, we mentioned, off in India, no one would know. But they still have all the records of it. And here's his death. And you think, all on your own, by yourself, not in a group, mass suicide, not in a thing where we're all just following this one guy, as we're all at the same willingness, and we're all willing to individually give up our lives, totally on our own, when maybe even none of the others know about it. You're like, what motivates that? It's not a fanaticism. It's not because I mean, it's not. I don't think it's reasonable to say you got 12 fanatics who are all on the same level. So you're like, that's not fanaticism. Then you go back down. You're like, one fanatic doesn't spur that, where they're doing that on their own. So it's really significant when you make the cults comparisons. When people bring that up, is how they died, and that they died individually over many years, in where it could have been in ways that none of the others even would have known about it. That they had all the outs they could have found, but they kept on anyway, and without, as far as we know, apparently without getting wealthy, without any of the things that if you were doing this for your selfish gain, that none of those things were coming to be for them. No. So that'd be my key, primary response, I guess.
What do you guys?
All right, I'm gonna ask this in first person.
Okay.
You gave us reasons why the resurrection occurred because of transformed lives that occurred.
That
Jews became Christians, disciples martyred.
I wouldn't call those individual reasons, but yeah.
Close.
Okay, go ahead.
But I can give you centuries of examples from the Middle Ages of Christians doing things in God's name.
Yeah.
How could that actually be a real God if people are doing
Right.
that, living that way,
Right.
with your few examples? Again, first person.
Yeah.
I'm exaggerating.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
This is how someone's going to respond. Of,
Right.
I see a lot of Christians doing things in God's name. There can't be a God
Yeah.
when that's going on. That guy at least.
Well, there's two things to say. One is, isn't it true that people who are not following God do just similar terrible things and have done that, if not worse? Simple, yeah. Right? We all know the answer to that. Okay. Well, I have no problem saying that many of those people that we were talking about just weren't following Jesus. They weren't Christians. That they're Christian in name because it was a cultural, phenomena that we were like, well, we're the center of the, Christian society or whatever. Here we are in Constantinople or whatever places. I don't know why I would assume, based on what I see, I don't know why I'd assume that, okay, well, these people are following Jesus and they're actually living the faith. I'm not seeing evidence of that from the people that we're referring to. Do I think there are people that are following? Obviously, I think there's people that were. But what we're referring to is the people who are doing certain things. Well, I'm like, well, why would I look at that and say, oh, well, they're Christians doing that? I'd say, well, my evidence is that they're not. Now, I don't know that. I don't get to make the judgment. But as far as the reality judgment about them, but when I'm trying to assess a question, I'm like, well, I don't know. I don't have good reason to think that they're really following Jesus and that they're true believers. So that's where I would go. I don't have a problem saying that because it seems problematic.
Matthew 7 talks about that.
But what?
On when they go away and never knew for you, hey, God did all these things in your name, God
Yeah.
responds with
Yeah.
people might think they're doing things in
Right.
God's
Right.
reality.
Yeah, doing things in God's name. I mean, that's not a way to do. We wouldn't want to do very many things that way. It's,
But anyway, okay.
yeah, but that's the kind of what's caused the problem. I mean, say, well, they're doing that to kind of justify what they're doing to the people, for the people, and that therefore this is necessary. We're doing what God needs us to do. It's like, when you get into the Crusades and stuff, it's like the first one, I think the first two had good cause, and then you get into the ones that everybody has problems about because it seems totally unnecessary in a lot of ways, and the things that were happening, and you think this is just about church power and not about what the real cause was of the first crusade. But it's but you could look into what they're saying about that. If you do this is going to make some difference on your credit with God for in purgatory and heaven and all that stuff. And that's what's coming from the popes and things like that. But anyway, why would I think people, based on what they're doing, that they're actually Christians? I say, well, my suspicion, right? I don't get to decide it, but my suspicion is that they're not. Those are not Christians. They're just acting in the name of, and that yes has done a lot of damage. But people in the world that are not Christians have done all the same stuff. So, yeah.
Let's go around again. Guys in the back corner.
Second question then, so you brought up how Jesus fulfills a statistically astronomical amount of the prophecies in the Bible.
Yeah.
If that is really the case, why do so many people who are Jewish resist
It's
Christianity?
it's a fascinating question. So, well, I don't really know why. I don't know, like, because you have to take it person by person. Like, why don't you? It's a great question for someone who has a Jewish background, or especially if they're like active and Orthodox. Why don't you make the connection here and see this, like, and actually put some stock in this? So it seems pretty compelling for someone who believes the Old Testament, and then you look at the Gospels and with what you see, they could make the case, not that things were added to the Old Testament, but they could try to make the case things were added into the New Testament. But the manuscript evidence they talked about kind of makes that a little more difficult thing to say, because it hasn't been all these additions of things that are having to do with the prophecies. Those are not in the categories of the things that are in question. So you say, it looks like almost my suspicion is we got a heart resistance. It's a different level thing. It's not an intellectual. It's on some kind of obligation to my people or to my heritage, or maybe there's even not just I don't want to deal with that because here's what that would mean, and that's not where I want to go. But when I've talked with people who might be Buddhist, and they're like, well, I wouldn't want to do this. I'm really interested in it, but I can't go anymore and learn any more about this, because if I do, I'm going to become an embarrassment to my family. And so I'm not going to do that, because that's what that would mean if I decide to become a Christian. And you think, okay, so here's a Buddhist doing that. And now you go into the Jewish context, you've got those kind of issues that are coming up as well. So I think this is just my first thought about it as I've thought about that question is just there's all those hard things coming into play where people are it's not intellectual. It's not I'm trying to assess what the truth is. It's they're counting costs, and they're like, well, it's not worth it to me. It would seem, because they should at least be like, this is really interesting, because they're the prophecies that are in their own text. So you would expect, when they're not even interested in that. Now, there's some people that are interested, and they're like, it's just not enough. Fine, but then we should be able to identify what would be enough, and that's the resurrection, right? And then they should be honest about that. But when they're not even interested in these things, then you're like, okay, there's something else going on.
Next question.
So we had a two-parter, so I promise I'm not reading the Divine Revelation first. So if you think about, as you described, general and special revelation, and the way they work together, you think about Romans 1:20. Today, an atheist might say, science is getting better and better at proving all of the things that create the wonder that they did in the early church. So if, as you described it, God gives everyone general revelation, and then to some special, under that sort of framework, you would imagine that as science gets better, and there's a more compelling argument that there is no creator because science can prove things, that there would be more special revelation.
What are they proving?
That the universe had a way to expand, that there are quarks that come into and out of existence. There are certain elements that can, I don't know, I'm not a scientist, but they're like, science is making this more plausible, like even than 100 years ago, to be an atheist. So you would think that your number of special revelations would be higher if that was how those things work together.
Yeah.
And not less, and
Yeah.
maybe they'd argue that.
A couple things. Let's say someone's this wouldn't be me, but if someone is, say, affirming all those things, and they say, okay, all that's persuasive to me, and say, well, you still have a beginning issue, and something coming from nothing, and then we can get into the probabilities of life from non-life. And you have a monumental challenges to overcome on that, just on those initial things. But science is also revealing a lot of things about that necessitate design, and saying, well, you don't get this without design. That's not something things that don't evolve, for example, where they talk about, Stephen Meyer talks about like the flagellum and things, and that they're irreducible complexity, things that through science they find that there's no reducing this, it's irreducible. And so this would have to be as is, and it doesn't, have an evolving to that. That's problematic, obviously. So I'm just saying science is showing things the other way too. Now someone might not know anything about that stuff. And so when we say the science is answering a lot of things in one way, well, it's also answering things the other way and making a case there. So the other part of it on the general revelation, though, is it's important that it's not just on one category on general revelation. It's also in the morality, purpose, and those things, the need for a beginning, and you have those categories that are coming into the general revelation too, and it's not just on this one. Science has come up with some answers about in one category that someone might find persuasive, and they might be their field, right? And they're like, this is persuasive to me. This really matters to me, right? It could be saying, okay, what are you doing with those other categories? And those are the ones I'd be wanting to talk about. And so I think that's where it's helpful and important that it's not just in one category. But I don't know, we have follow up on that. Okay.
Right, and we have time.
With both yours, I feel like there's more that I'm not getting to. So
And you're gonna be around
I know.
afterwards if anyone, yeah. Last question over here.
I realized in our discussions, I kind of misasked the question because I was equating objections to faith with objections to church. And, but at the same time, I think that's a real issue for people, that their experience of Christians, their experience of church, leads them away from faith.
Yes. This is good.
I don't know what the question is.
Okay, I can create a question out of that. Gosh, there's an equating that goes on. You go to a restaurant, you get terrible service, and it's a really bad experience. I never want to go back there. But not just there, I don't want to go to the other location either, or the other location in another state. I don't want to go to that. Right? Well, what are you doing? If you're equating an experience with this place and you're bringing things together that don't necessarily follow, because of course it was a person, right? It's not the establishment. Right? So, generally, it's not the establishment. It's a person who was doing a terrible job and probably should be fired. Okay, so you then equate that to the whole, now you can reason out of that, of course, and be like, well, that's ridiculous. It was the person's fault. It wasn't McDonald's or whatever. So same thing here. You have people have an experience of the church, have an experience of Christians, and then I equate that with Christianity. They define now Christianity for me, but not in any kind of principles or beliefs, right? But just in terms of an experience I had, that's defining it for me. At UW years ago, there was a survey I was a part of, and I had a student that wanted to talk to this kid in my dorm. So I went with her, and we got to go through this whole questionnaire with him and talk through. And so after doing that, anyway, he says, I used to actually be involved in my church. We just shared it. And I was a leader in our youth group. And then he said, but whatever, a few years ago. I was in a relationship with the youth pastor, turned abusive. Now, I don't know if that was, what connotation that was. That's not what matters. But it is, now I could say, well, we need to, do you know the Lord, Liar, Lunatic argument? Have you, or do you want to talk about whatever? I'm not going to, that's nonsense to do right there, right? So it was, you understand the category of what's going on here. That this person is not dealing with intellectual issues about the faith. They're dealing with, there's an emotional reality of an experience, and that's been really hard. And they're dealing with separating things. And you find that you're equating things in a way that's conflating, right? So I asked this guy the question. I said, that makes sense. That'd be really hard, first of all. And it'd be kind of a, lack of a desire to get involved and pursue, getting involved in your faith and pursuing your faith. That would make sense. That would follow. So do you think you've been able to separate what happened and what people did from Jesus and who he is? And I love his answer. He said, I'm trying to. So we recognize it, but it was like, that's the heart of that. That's where the issue is can you separate that? I had a discussion with a girl one time when I was in Oregon State, and she says, she had all these problems with Christianity. Her roommate had become a Christian. She'd been coming to a class I do in Apologetics, and her friend had been bringing her. She became a Christian, so she tells her friend, she's like, I have to tell my friend and that I became a Christian. She tells her friend I became a Christian. Her friend said, that's the worst thing you could ever have told me. Anyway, that's the person that says. And that summer, it's like, I want to have talk with her. We want to talk with her about her faith, because we avoid it all the time. And she had met me a couple times, and we were doing ministry down there. And so she said, she agreed to meet with us. She's like, okay, we'll talk. And we're like, we just want to hear what bothers you so much about Christianity. She's like, oh, I don't want to offend you. And we're like, you can say whatever you want. We're not going to be offended. And she goes into talking about thing after thing after thing. And at the end of it, we're like, yeah, 90% of it, we agree. Not good. Bothers us too. He's like, but you're still Christians? What the heck? And I said, and I tried to share with her, okay, because that proves the point. Everything you're talking about proves the point that we suck.
That's good.
And that we need Jesus. And we're still Christians. We're Christians not because of the church, not because of, all these things you're talking about. We're Christians because of Jesus and just because of who Jesus is. That's it. And we see all sorts of problems in the church, and the reason there's problems is because there's people, and we know about people. And what I care about is that people are actually trying and want to grow, and we're trying to figure it out. You're concerned if we're not interested in that, right? Then we're like, okay, well, maybe there's not a lot of hope, right? But that was meaningful to her. Eventually she apparently, I don't know if, in the long run, but apparently she accepted Christ. But that's what I was told by the girls. But, it wasn't that day. It was, that's just a part of a conversation that is, well, as we said earlier, right? It's planting the seeds. It's tilling the soil and kind of helping her to see it differently. Be like, okay. But it was really good to say to her, yeah, those things are bad. Those are not good. We want to fix those. And in fact, some places have fixed it. Some people, that's not everywhere. And we recognize it, and we care about that stuff. And that's meaningful to them. And they say, okay, I didn't even know that you guys even cared about this, and that mattered to you. And then when you see that people are putting attention to that, okay, well now we can talk about why are we still a Christian? We're still a Christian because it's all about who Jesus Christ is. And I believe he is actually the Son of God, right? And because he died for us. And everything you're talking about proves the point. Yeah, the other girl, that her friend, that before she became a Christian, we had a conversation about that too. She said, I said, what are your problems with Christianity? She said, I got two things. I said, only two? Oh my gosh, like, because she'd been arguing about everything. And she says, or one, we talked about one of them that day, but she said, the Bible's so negative about us. And it bothers me, and like, you know, because she wants to think, I mean, she was kind of thinking we're good, and think it's just like, it's so negative. I said, well, what would you say if the Bible was just being honest? Would it still be negative? Or would it just, like, if it's true, would it just still be negative, or just being honest and telling us the truth? And literally, in 1 minute, she was like, oh, okay. If it's just being honest and telling us the truth, then that's not necessarily negative. It's like, what are you supposed to do? What are you supposed to say? You know, we don't want God to lie to us if there's a God. So you're like, that went by the wayside. But there's all these things that we're trying to find a way to navigate with the person. And in none of those situations is it, oh, let me give you an argument for the existence of God. Let me talk about, you know, the resurrection or something. That until they bring it up, I'm not going there. But we have to work through those emotional things, and knowing that, hey, that's real and that matters, and the way they feel is probably appropriate to whatever they experienced. But we don't have to see it that way. There's other ways to see it, as far as in the way of separating things from who God is and who Christ is. Yeah. So, we got one more.
It's a short question,
Do it.
you can do it in 2 sentences, how's that?
Last one.
When talking with other denominations, specifically Catholicism, when we talk about praying to the saints or the purpose of communion, how much should we go into that, or just allow that, or is there a line that we should assert ourselves or no?
It's not 2 sentences.
It would be.
But is there a line? I will say this.
Or we just allow them to have their apocryphy moment or whatever, or not?
There's a lot we agree on, and we can share that and be, you know, appreciative of the things that we agree on, and not just about God and Jesus, but in culture, etc. You know, and be like, okay, there's a lot of good coming together points here. I've got Catholics in my family, and just in a point of no, that's not. I don't believe that, and I'm okay with saying that. But I respect the fact that they believe something. What I generally find I want to say, the challenge to do is to say, well, okay, why I don't believe that. Why don't I believe it? And I want to give a reason for that to them. And there's a lot of examples of things here as to why you might disagree with something. But one thing is on the what's it called, the Apocrypha, the 9 books in the middle. Well, why would I not accept that? Well, the reason I don't accept it is because it wasn't included in the first century Jewish scriptures. And at that point, if it wasn't in the first century scriptures in the Old Testament, it wasn't considered the scripture by the Jews, right? Well, then if the covenant ends and now you start the new covenant, and then you get the text for the new covenant, and those were written before, then they're in the Old Testament times. Well, then they belong in the Old Testament. They're not in the New Testament. Okay, well, if the Jews didn't include it, then it's not included. That'd be the reason. So now they might disagree with me, but I just want to be like, hear their reason and be like, okay. But I want to have a reason on the other side. And so when and on any other issues that we're not in agreement on, you know, we can hear them out and be like, well, I don't buy that one. But then I want to be able to say, here's why. And have a respectful conversation, and knowing that changes here are slow, right? These take a long time. And recognizing that up front helps. So.
questions, guys. Dwayne, I don't have the ability to change the slide right now, but there are some resources I'm gonna be sending out. Nah, it's all right. There's some resources that I'm gonna be sending out that Dwayne's put together for everyone. It's just different authors and books you can read, specific topics that certain authors.
I'll show you two.
And a website as well. Standard
Some recommendations. Standard Reason is a great resource. Two books that I just grabbed real quick that I put on the list for engaging with people about our faith. Tactics by Greg Koppel. He's with Standard Reason. You can find all some stuff on this on the SDR site. Just tremendous on engaging with people in a strategic way, so you can see the like chessboard type picture. If you want to take a look. But then another book is God, Human Image. This is Sean McDowell. These are topical, where you just go and look at the table of contents, like, okay, here's the questions that they're addressing. And these are really helpful, but on the list, there's a number of them that are like this. But there's great resources that you can use in sorting out certain topics, and not just that they're not just, well, I got to read this whole thing, and it's the whole book on one topic. I mean, it's very much you can address a couple chapters, and then another book, a couple chapters, but that's all. Then you're really able to get into a subject. But there's so much on these. That list is just ones that I think are really really well done.
All right, well, let's thank Dwayne